I had been gone 8 months, bouncing between airports and hotel rooms, living out of a suitcase while I wrapped up an overseas project that had swallowed my calendar whole. By the time my flight landed back in Missouri, all I wanted was my own bed, a quiet morning by the lake, and the familiar comfort of home. As I drove through Ravenwood Shores, the sun was just coming up, spilling gold across the water the same way it always had. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Then I turned onto my driveway. I stopped so fast I nearly stalled the car. The west wing of my house was gone. Not damaged, not partially torn apart, gone. Where my guest wing had stood for decades, there was only rubble, splintered beams, crushed stone, twisted rebar, and long strips of yellow caution tape flapping in the breeze. Nearly a third of my home had been erased, like someone had taken a bite out of it and decided that was good enough. I got out of the car on shaking legs and walked closer, my ears ringing. Stapled to what remained of my front door was a bright yellow notice, already curling at the edges. Delinquent HOA dues. Demolition authorized. It was signed by the HOA board leader, neat and confident, like this had been just another box checked on a clipboard. What no one on that board bothered to check, what they never imagined, was that I didn't just own the house they had destroyed. I owned the land beneath every single home in that neighborhood, roads, shoreline easements, soil, every inch of it. And the HOA had just demolished property sitting on ground they leased from me. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Ravenwood Shores was never supposed to be dramatic. It was designed in the early 1960s as a quiet, upscale lake community, built on a long-term ground lease model that most people barely understood when they signed their paperwork. Homeowners owned their houses. I, through a family trust established decades ago, owned the land beneath them. It was old school, conservative, and rock solid from a legal standpoint. I inherited that trust years ago and folded it into my broader commercial real estate portfolio. By then, I was already deep into large-scale development work, shopping centers, industrial parks, renewable energy sites, projects that required spreadsheets, lawyers, and patience, not neighborhood politics. Ravenwood Shores was passive income. The leases were clear, the payments were automated, and the HOA existed only to handle surface-level issues like landscaping standards and mailbox colors. They had rules, but they did not have power. I never lived there full-time. I came and went as my schedule allowed. Sometimes I stayed a week, sometimes a month, sometimes not at all. My house was maintained, insured, staffed when necessary, and fully compliant. I paid my dues through a corporate account that had never missed a deadline. From my perspective, Ravenwood Shores ran quietly in the background of my life. From the HOA's perspective, that silence became an invitation. The board leader at the time was Brenda Locke, a woman who treated her position like a badge and her signature like a weapon. She noticed my house sat empty more often than others. She noticed I wasn't at meetings. She noticed I didn't respond personally to newsletters or community emails. What she didn't notice, or didn't care to verify, was that absence is not abandonment, and authority is not ownership. An accounting error triggered everything. A payment was misfiled under a corporate name instead of a personal one. Instead of picking up the phone, Brenda flagged the account. Instead of checking county records, she labeled the property delinquent. Each small assumption stacked on the next, turning a clerical issue into a manufactured violation. Notices were sent, but not to me. They went to an outdated address pulled from an old HOA roster, not the legally designated contact on file with the trust. No certified letters, no legal review, no attempt to confirm who actually owned what. Just assumptions reinforced by entitlement. Brenda framed it as enforcement. She told the board the property was non-compliant, unpaid, and effectively abandoned. She spoke confidently, using phrases like protecting property values and setting an example. A couple of board members hesitated, asking whether demolition was excessive. Brenda brushed them off. She insisted the bylaws gave them the authority. That time was being wasted. That letting one property slide would weaken their control. Control. That word mattered more to her than accuracy. By the time I was halfway across the world, signing contracts under fluorescent lights, a demolition order had been approved without a title search, without a court order, and without anyone bothering to confirm the most basic fact of all, whose land they were standing on. When the machines finally rolled in, no one stopped them. Not the board, not the contractor, not the neighbors who watched a piece of the community's history get torn down in a single morning. And when I came home, jet-lagged and exhausted, I didn't walk into peace and quiet. I walked into proof that the HOA had confused paperwork with power, and they were about to learn how expensive that mistake really was. Most people in Ravenwood Shores only knew me as a name on old documents, if they knew me at all. Eleanor Graves. That was it. No gossip, no neighborhood sightings, no holiday cards. And that was exactly how I wanted it. My relationship with that community was never emotional. It was contractual. Ravenwood Shores existed because my family allowed it to exist. Back in 1963, when the lakefront land was still considered risky and undeveloped, my grandfather structured the entire project as a ground lease community. It was clean, conservative, and designed to last generations. Homeowners would own their houses outright, but the land beneath them would remain under a long-term lease controlled by a family trust. Roads, shoreline, green space, easements, even the soil itself all stayed under one umbrella. It protected the land from fragmentation and ensured consistent standards without day-to-day micromanagement. Over the decades, the trust passed down to me. By the time I took control, I was already a commercial real estate investor with a portfolio spread across multiple states. Shopping centers, logistics facilities, renewable infrastructure. I dealt in projects that required patience, lawyers, and an appreciation for quiet leverage. Ravenwood Shores was simple by comparison. The leases were clear, the payments were automated. The terms were so tightly written that most people never bothered to read them past the first few pages. That included the HOA. The Homeowners Association was created to handle appearances, not ownership, lawn height, exterior paint palettes, noise complaints. That was it. They had no authority over land, no right to modify structures without consent, and absolutely no power to enforce demolition. Their bylaws even said so. If anyone bothered to read past the bold headings, I never attended meetings. I never voted. I never tried to influence board elections. I didn't need to. Power like mine works best when it stays invisible. As long as the community ran smoothly and the leases were honored, I stayed out of the way. Even my own home followed that philosophy. The mansion on the lake had been restored carefully, preserved rather than modernized, and maintained whether I was there or not. When work pulled me overseas, staff checked on it. Utilities stayed on. Security systems ran quietly. Nothing about the house was abandoned, neglected, or out of compliance. But absence has a way of making small-minded people feel bold. Brenda Locke had been HOA board leader for less than a year when things started to shift. She was the kind of person who took volunteer authority personally, like it filled a gap something else hadn't. Clipboards, warning letters, enforcement notices. Those were her tools, and she used them aggressively. To her, rules weren't guidelines. They were weapons. She noticed my house sat dark more often than others. She noticed no one answered HOA emails with my personal signature. She noticed I wasn't present to be intimidated. What she didn't notice was that my dues were paid on time, every time, through a corporate account tied directly to the trust. What she didn't check was the lease structure that gave her board permission to exist in the first place. It started with a bookkeeping error. One payment was logged under the trust's legal name instead of my personal name. A minor clerical issue, the kind that gets resolved with a phone call or a quick email. Brenda didn't make either. Instead, she flagged the account as unpaid. Then she treated that flag like confirmation. She told the treasurer the property was delinquent. She told the board it was a problem. Each retelling added a little more certainty, a little more drama. By the time it reached the agenda, it was no longer a question. It was a violation. Notices were generated automatically and sent to an address pulled from an outdated HOA roster. That address hadn't been valid in years. No certified mail. No attempt to cross-check county records. No consultation with legal counsel. Brenda insisted it wasn't necessary. She said the bylaws gave them all the authority they needed. Authority, to her, was something you took by acting confident enough. As weeks passed, more assumptions piled up. The house was labeled non-responsive, then non-compliant, then abandoned. Each label justified the next step. Each step made her feel more powerful. Any board member who hesitated was talked over or dismissed. One of them asked whether demolition required a court order. Brenda snapped back that they were well within their rights and accused him of being soft. No one wanted to fight her, so they let it continue. From across the ocean, I had no idea any of this was happening. I was negotiating contracts, walking job sites, dealing with government permits and billion-dollar timelines. Ravenwood Shores never crossed my mind. It had never caused trouble before. There was no reason to think it ever would. That was the danger of being the quiet owner. No one noticed. Brenda saw silence and assumed weakness. She saw distance and assumed absence. She saw a dark house and convinced herself it was fair game. Every decision she made was based on convenience instead of verification. Every shortcut fed her sense of control. And with each unchecked assumption, she moved closer to a line she didn't even realize existed. By the time she pushed for the final escalation, she truly believed she was untouchable. She had no idea she was standing on land that answered to me, and she certainly didn't understand that when someone like me stays quiet, it isn't because we're powerless. It's because we're waiting. Once Brenda decided my house was a problem, she stopped treating it like a question and started treating it like a mission. Every conversation, every email, every agenda item circled back to the same phrase she loved repeating: non-compliant and delinquent. She said it so often it stopped sounding like an accusation and started sounding like a verdict. She brought the treasurer, Mark Ellis, into it first. Mark wasn't aggressive by nature, but he was nervous, and nervous people cling to authority figures. Brenda showed him spreadsheets highlighting the misapplied payment, ignoring the corresponding deposits that clearly balanced the account. She framed it as a risk. If we let one property slide, she told him, everyone else will try it. Mark nodded, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge her. He signed off on the delinquency notice and told himself it wasn't his decision anyway. Next came Diane Keller, the enforcement chair. Diane loved rules, not because she understood them deeply, but because they gave her structure. Brenda fed that instinct perfectly. She told Diane the house was abandoned, that it was bringing down property values, that neighbors had complained. None of that was true, but it didn't need to be. Diane didn't ask for proof. She asked what the next step was. Together they built a narrative. The house wasn't just unpaid, it was a problem, a symbol of what happened when the HOA didn't act decisively. Brenda framed enforcement as responsibility and hesitation as weakness. Every time someone raised a concern, She responded with confidence and volume. People stopped interrupting her because it was easier to let her talk than to argue. The only person who didn't back down was Tom Alvarez. Tom was a retired engineer who treated documents like facts, not suggestions. When Brenda proposed escalating enforcement, he asked for proof of ownership. When she suggested fines, he asked where the authority came from. When demolition was floated for the first time, he went silent, then asked a single question that hung in the room. Do we actually have the legal right to do that? Brenda dismissed him immediately. She said the bylaws allowed for corrective action. She said abandonment laws applied. She said the board had discretion. Tom asked to see the legal opinion supporting that claim. There wasn't one. Instead of arguing further, Tom started documenting everything. He requested meeting minutes. He saved emails. He sent follow-up messages summarizing conversations, asking for confirmation. Brenda hated that. She accused him of undermining the board, of being disloyal, of slowing things down. Diane rolled her eyes whenever he spoke. Mark avoided meeting his gaze. At the next meeting, when demolition was officially proposed as necessary compliance, Tom stood up and said he couldn't be part of it. He stated, calmly and on the record, that the board had not verified ownership, had not confirmed delinquency, and had not sought legal review. He said proceeding would expose the HOA to massive liability. Brenda responded by accusing him of fear-mongering. Tom resigned that night. His resignation was recorded, noted, and then immediately forgotten. To Brenda, it felt like victory. One less obstacle. One less voice asking inconvenient questions. With Tom gone, dissent evaporated. The remaining board members told themselves that if it were truly illegal, someone would have stopped it by now. That was how demolition stopped being unthinkable and became inevitable. No title search was ordered. No county records were pulled. No one bothered to check the ground lease that sat, unchanged, in the trust archives. No court order was requested, because that would have required a judge to ask questions. Brenda didn't want questions. She wanted action. She contacted a demolition contractor the way someone orders a service, not realizing she was commissioning an irreversible act. The contractor asked whether permits were in place. Brenda assured them they were, handled internally. He asked about ownership. She said the HOA had authority. He asked about notice to the owner. She said notices had been sent. Each answer was vague enough to avoid scrutiny and confident enough to move things forward. The date was chosen deliberately. Valentine's Day. Brenda said it was symbolic. Fresh start. Deanne liked the idea of sending a message. Mark didn't comment, but he signed the check. The contractor scheduled the crew for early morning, when fewer people would be around and questions would be minimal. In the days leading up to it, Brenda sent one final notice to the same wrong address, marking it as final warning. She told the board that silence meant consent. She said abandonment laws allowed them to proceed. She said delaying any further would make the HOA look weak. No one stopped her. On Valentine's Day morning, heavy equipment rolled into Ravenwood shores, while most of the neighborhood was still asleep. Metal jaws closed around wood that had stood for generations. Walls fell. Roof lines collapsed. Dust rose into the cold air and settled on the lake like ash. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, uneasy but silent. Someone took a photo. Someone else asked whether this was really allowed. The contractor pointed to the paperwork he'd been given and kept working. By midday, the west wing of my home no longer existed. By afternoon, Brenda signed off on completion. She took photos, she filed them. She wrote a short note congratulating the board on decisive enforcement. She believed she had proven her authority, restored order, and protected the community. What she didn't realize was that every step she took without permission made the consequences worse. Every shortcut amplified the damage. Every assumption stacked the case against her higher. By choosing power over verification, Brenda didn't just cross a line. She erased it. And when I finally turned onto my driveway and saw what she'd done, the reality she had ignored for months was about to surface all at once. Because power taken without permission doesn't disappear quietly. It collapses. I didn't go inside right away. I stood there at the edge of my driveway, staring at the space where my west wing used to be, trying to make my brain accept what my eyes were seeing. The house felt wrong, like a familiar face with part of it missing. Exposed framing jutted out into open air. Electrical lines hung loose. The smell of torn wood and pulverized concrete still lingered, sharp and dusty, like the damage was fresh enough to hurt. Shock has a strange way of slowing everything down. For a few minutes, maybe longer, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel anything. I just walked the perimeter in silence, stepping carefully over debris, taking in the scale of what had been done. This wasn't cosmetic. This wasn't a mistake that could be patched over with an apology. Someone had ordered heavy machinery onto my property and let it tear through a structure that had stood for decades. That was when I saw the notice on the door. Bright yellow, bold text, confident language. The kind of paper people use when they want to look official without actually being right. Delinquent HOA dues. Demolition authorized, signed neatly at the bottom. I took it down, folded it once, and put it in my pocket. Shock gave way to clarity. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't confront a neighbor. I didn't raise my voice. I got back in my car, drove to a quiet spot down the road where I had cell service, and called my attorney, Caleb Morrison. Caleb had handled my property matters for years, ground leases, easements, disputes between municipalities and land trusts. This was his world. When he answered, I didn't dramatize it. I told him exactly what I was looking at. Demolition. Show a notice. Valentine's Day. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Don't touch anything, he said finally. I'm pulling records now. Within an hour, he confirmed what I already knew in my bones. My dues were paid, every single one, on time, logged, cleared. The so-called delinquency was a bookkeeping error that never should have survived first review, let alone justified demolition. No court order existed, no lien, no verified abandonment, no legal authority of any kind. What the HOA had done wasn't just wrong, it was indefensible. Caleb drove out that afternoon. We walked the site together while he took photos and dictated notes. He was calm, professional, precise. The kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how bad this was about to get for the other side. They've crossed every line that matters, he said quietly, and they've done it in writing. That night, he drafted the first round of notices. Not angry letters, not threats. Formal legal notifications requesting documentation, authority citations, and proof of ownership verification. Each request was narrow. Each one was a trap. The HOA responded the next morning. Brenda's reply was brief, defensive, and smug. She cited bylaws. She claimed enforcement authority. She insisted the house had been abandoned and that the board acted in good faith. Caleb read it once and smiled. Okay, he said. Now we educate them. The first OA meeting after my return was packed. Word had spread fast. People wanted to see the mysterious owner whose house had been torn apart. Brenda sat at the front, posture stiff, jaw set. Mark and Diane flanked her, both avoiding eye contact. A few seats down, I noticed Tom Alvarez sitting quietly, notebook in hand. When public comment opened, Caleb stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He asked a single question. Before we go any further, can the board confirm who owns the land Ravenwood Shores is built on? Brenda frowned. She said the HOA managed the community. Caleb nodded politely and clarified. I didn't ask who manages the rules. I asked who owns the land. Silence spread through the room. Caleb continued. He explained step by step how Ravenwood Shores was structured, the 1963 ground lease, the trust, the fact that every homeowner leased their lot, roads, shoreline, and common areas included. He explained that the HOA existed only because the lease allowed it to operate as an administrative body. Then he gestured toward me. My client is the ground lessor. You could feel the air change. Brenda tried to interrupt. Caleb didn't let her. He explained that demolition of the ground lessor's property wasn't just unauthorized. It was a material breach of every lease in the development. That breach gave my trust the right to enforce remedies ranging from damages to lease termination. People started whispering. Someone asked what that meant for their mortgage. Someone else asked whether the HOA had even been allowed to order demolition in the first place. Brenda's confidence cracked. She repeated the word, bylaws, like it was a shield. Caleb dismantled that too. Bylaws did not override property law. They did not create ownership. They did not grant powers that never existed. By the time he finished, the board looked smaller. Not physically, but legally. Stripped down to what they really were, a volunteer committee that had mistaken routine authority for absolute control. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The truth was finally on the table, and it was heavier than anything Brenda had prepared for. She had acted as if the house were just another asset she could discipline. She had never imagined it was sitting on land that answered back. And now, with the damage done and the facts exposed, there was no undoing what she had authorized. There was only consequence. Caleb didn't rush the next step. That was the part Brenda never understood. Real leverage doesn't shout. It moves quietly, in writing, and it arrives all at once. Within 48 hours of the meeting, formal notices went out. Not fines, not threats, lease compliance reviews. They were neutral in tone, precise in language, and impossible to ignore. Each notice cited specific clauses from the original ground lease, sections most homeowners had never read and most board members had never bothered to understand. They weren't accusations. They were reminders. A statement that, following a material breach by the HOA acting as an agent of the lessees, the ground lessor was initiating a standard review of lease compliance across the development. Brenda's notice was delivered first. Certified. Signature required. She received it before lunch. By mid-afternoon, she was on the phone with Caleb, demanding to know what it meant. He didn't explain it to her. He told her to have her attorney call him. She said she didn't need one. He said that was unfortunate. The next round went out to mortgage lenders. That wasn't retaliation. It was procedure. Every ground lease included a disclosure requirement. If a lease entered review status due to material breach, lien holders had to be notified. Banks hated surprises, especially ones involving land they didn't actually own. The notices were factual. No dramatics. Just enough information to trigger internal alarms. It worked. Within days, homeowners started asking questions, real questions. Not about lawn height or mailbox paint, but about deeds and leases, and what exactly they had signed years ago at closing. People dug out old folders. Some called their realtors. Others called their banks. And slowly, uncomfortably, the truth surfaced. They didn't own the land. They never had. Their homes sat on leased ground, governed by a trust most of them had forgotten existed. The HOA didn't grant that structure. It was allowed by it. And now that structure was under review because the HOA had acted without authority. Panic spread unevenly. Some residents stayed calm, trusting that things would sort themselves out. Others spiraled. Social media groups lit up with speculation and half-understood legal terms. Brenda tried to contain it. First came intimidation. She sent a community-wide email accusing me of trying to scare residents. She framed the lease reviews as harassment. She claimed the HOA's actions were lawful and that everything would be resolved internally. She warned against speaking to outside attorneys. She insisted the board had everything under control. No one believed her. Then came denial. At the next meeting, Brenda claimed the ground lease was outdated, unenforceable, a technicality. She suggested that modern HOA law superseded it. Mark nodded along weakly. Diane stared at the table. Tom Alvarez sat in the back, arms crossed, watching the collapse he had tried to prevent. Residents asked direct questions. Brenda dodged them. Someone asked whether demolition of my house had triggered the lease review. She said no. Caleb calmly produced the clause that said otherwise. Someone else asked whether their mortgage could be affected. Brenda said no again. Caleb didn't contradict her. He let the lenders do that. By the third week, Brenda switched strategies. Damage control. She reached out privately, asking for meetings. She suggested settlements. She offered apologies that carefully avoided responsibility. She proposed that the HOA make things right. If the lease review could be stopped. Caleb declined every conversation that wasn't in writing. Meanwhile, the board began to fracture. Mark Ellis was the first to break. He sent an email distancing himself from the demolition decision, emphasizing that he had relied on Brenda's representations. He asked whether individual board members could be held personally liable. Caleb answered that question thoroughly. Diane followed. She resigned as enforcement chair, citing stress. Her resignation letter included a line about misunderstandings regarding authority. It was vague, but it was on record. Brenda stood alone at the front of the room now, still trying to project confidence, still using words like "what" and "us," even as her support evaporated. Every meeting grew more hostile. Residents demanded explanations she couldn't give. Questions turned sharp. Voices rose. Tom Alvarez finally spoke again. He reminded the room that he had warned them. He confirmed that he had documented everything. He said he would cooperate fully with any investigation. That was when people stopped looking at Brenda like a leader and started looking at her like a liability. The neighborhood changed tone after that. The panic didn't disappear, but it matured into understanding. Residents realized the lease review wasn't punishment. It was accountability. Innocent homeowners weren't being targeted. The process existed to correct a breach created by people who had overreached. I stayed out of sight during most of it. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't post online. I let the documents speak. Let the contracts do what they were designed to do. Eventually, the truth settled in. The HOA wasn't the foundation of Ravenwood Shores. It was a layer. And layers can crack, peel, and be removed. The ground beneath them, though, that belonged to someone else. And now, finally, everyone understood who. By the time the next HOA meeting was scheduled, everyone knew it wouldn't be routine. Cars lined both sides of the street. Folding chairs had to be brought in. Neighbors who had never attended a meeting in their lives showed up early, clutching folders and printouts, whispering to each other in tight, anxious voices. The room buzzed with the kind of tension that doesn't need a microphone to be felt. Brenda took her seat at the front like she always did, chin lifted, papers stacked neatly in front of her. Mark sat 2 chairs away, pale and silent. Diane's seat was empty. Tom Alvarez sat in the second row, notebook open, pen already moving. When the meeting was called to order, Brenda launched straight into a prepared statement. She talked fast, her words polished and defensive. She said the HOA had acted within its bylaws. She said the board had a duty to enforce compliance. She said the ground lease was being mischaracterized and that internal HOA rules took precedence when it came to community standards. That was when Caleb stood up. He didn't interrupt her. He waited until she finished, until she looked around the room, expecting nods of agreement. Then he spoke, calmly and evenly, like he was explaining something obvious to a room full of adults. "Bylaws do not override ownership," he said. "They never have. They never will." Brenda snapped back immediately. She said the HOA governed the community. She said the bylaws granted enforcement authority. She said abandonment rules applied. Her voice grew sharper with every sentence, louder, more insistent. Caleb didn't raise his voice to match hers. He cited state property law. He explained the legal difference between managing rules and owning land. He explained that an HOA's authority exists only within the boundaries of the rights granted to it. He explained that no bylaw, no matter how confidently written, could create powers that contradicted recorded property interests. Then he addressed the demolition. There was no court order, no verified delinquency, no abandonment determination, no ownership confirmation. Each point landed like a weight dropped onto the table. Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone asked why the HOA attorney hadn't warned them. Another resident asked whether the board members could be personally sued. A third asked whether their mortgage was now at risk. Brenda tried to answer all of them at once. She deflected, she minimized, she accused me indirectly of manipulation. She said fear was being used as a tactic. That was when the OA's attorney stood up. He cleared his throat, adjusted his jacket, and asked for the floor. The room went silent. He said he had reviewed the situation further. He said new information had come to light regarding ownership and lease authority. He said that, effective immediately, his firm was withdrawing representation from the HOA due to a conflict and concerns about prior actions taken without legal review. He didn't look at Brenda when he said it. He gathered his files and walked out. The sound of the door closing behind him was louder than any argument that night. Chaos followed. Residents stood up, talking over one another. Some were angry. Some were scared. Some demanded resignations on the spot. Brenda tried to regain control, pounding the gavel, insisting everyone sit down. No one listened. Mark finally spoke, his voice shaking, saying maybe the meeting should be adjourned. That only made things worse. Tom Alvarez stood and addressed the room. He said he had objected from the beginning. He said he had warned the board. He said he had records of every concern he raised and every dismissal he received. He said he was prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation or legal proceeding. People turned toward Brenda. For the first time since this started, she looked genuinely rattled, not angry, not defiant, cornered. She repeated the word bylaws, again weaker this time, like it might still save her if she said it enough. It didn't. The meeting ended without a vote, without resolutions, without order. People filed out in clusters, talking urgently, calling spouses, texting attorneys. The authority Brenda had relied on evaporated in real time, replaced by a collective realization that something had gone very wrong. That night, Caleb and I didn't celebrate. We worked. He finalized the complaint: trespass, destruction of property, breach of lease, gross negligence, each claim supported by documentation, photographs, emails, meeting minutes, and signatures. There was no drama in the language. Just facts laid out cleanly and carefully. The lawsuit was filed the next morning. By the time Brenda woke up, it was already on record. The HOA she had tried to rule through confidence and intimidation now faced something far more rigid than bylaws or meetings or gavel strikes. It faced the law, and unlike volunteer authority, the law doesn't bend for tone, titles, or excuses. The courtroom felt like a different world. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting stripes across the polished wooden floor. I sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, heart hammering, but strangely calm. Across from me, the HOA board fidgeted, shuffling papers, exchanging nervous glances. Brenda, the treasurer, kept her eyes glued to her lap, her confident facade cracking with each passing second. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an unwavering tone, began methodically dissecting their case. Every claim they had made was met with pointed questions, each answer revealing gaps too wide to ignore. "You allege abandonment," she said, voice echoing, yet the property was maintained daily. "Evidence shows repeated use by board members without permission. How do you justify this?" Brenda's lips tightened. No response came. She had nothing. The judge moved through their authority. Claims with surgical precision. HOA bylaws, meeting minutes, even letters threatening fines. They all crumbled under scrutiny. Authority is not a blank check, the judge declared. It exists only within the law and bylaws. Anything beyond that is null and void. I could feel the tension in the room shift. The board, once so assured, now seemed small, vulnerable. Their lawyer flailed, citing technicalities, but each objection was brushed aside. Evidence, photographs, sworn statements, they were irrefutable. Then came the damages. The judge's words struck like thunder. Compensatory damages awarded for property destruction and distress. Punitive damages will be levied personally against Brenda Whitman for her repeated, willful violations. Brenda's face drained of color. Her hands shook slightly on the table. The courtroom was silent. Not a single whisper, not even a shuffle of papers. You could hear the heartbeat of the city in that stillness. I allowed myself a slow exhale. Justice had arrived, clean and unyielding. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. Every threat, every fine, every illegal maneuver the HOA had tried to wield against me had been dismantled in a single, undeniable verdict. Neighbors peeked from the back, eyes wide, some nodding silently. Their own experiences, once dismissed, now carried weight. The power dynamics had shifted. Today, the law had not favored fear. It favored fairness. When the gavel struck, final and decisive, I felt a strange weight lift off my shoulders. Brenda avoided my gaze, retreating into a shell of embarrassment and defeat. The board whispered among themselves, impotent and exposed. Outside, the air felt different, almost electric, as if the world itself had acknowledged the victory. I stayed for a moment, letting it sink in. No shouting, no celebration, just quiet acknowledgement that the rules, when known and enforced, could protect the ordinary from the entitled. The lesson was simple. Brutal and satisfying authority carries responsibility, and abuse carries consequences. For the first time in months, I felt the peace of standing on solid ground, knowing that what was right had prevailed. The skeleton of my former struggle remained, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer defiance, it was proof. Proof that patience, knowledge, and courage could turn the tables, and that even small victories could have lasting, undeniable impact. The courtroom emptied slowly. Brenda lingered a moment longer, alone at the back, before finally slipping away, her silence heavier than any words she could have spoken. Outside, the world continued, oblivious to the private justice that had quietly reshaped a small corner of it. And I walked out with the calm certainty that sometimes the law itself was the most effective revenge. The aftermath settled over Ravenwood shores like a calm after a storm. The air, once thick with tension and whispered threats, now carried a subtle clarity, a sense that the old rules had been rewritten and the old power stripped away. The HOA, once a looming force in every corner of the neighborhood, dissolved quietly. Its reserves, the money once used to intimidate and punish, were seized and redistributed according to law. The board members, who had once wielded authority like a weapon, were left to face their own accountability, settling individually and quietly, their bravado gone. Brenda Whitman was the most visible casualty. The treasurer who had so eagerly trampled over the neighborhood's rights suddenly found herself exposed. Her lease evaporated under scrutiny, an ironic twist that left her without a foothold in the very community she had tried to dominate. Without land, her home was trapped, unsellable, a tangible reminder of her missteps. Slowly, quietly, she slipped away from Ravenwood Shores, leaving behind the house she had hoped would cement her status, a ghost of her ambition. The neighbors, who had once lived in silent fear of fines, arbitrary rules, and selective enforcement, began to breathe again. Conversations at the mailbox were no longer hushed. Children's laughter returned to yards that had been the stage for quiet intimidation. The community, bruised but resilient, reorganized under new management. Rules were clarified, boundaries were respected. The lessons of the past were carved into the neighborhood's collective memory: knowledge of the law, courage to act, and unity among neighbors were more powerful than the bravest threats. Some old board members tried to slip back into influence quietly, but the precedent had been set. No one dared abuse authority again. Ravenwood Shores became a place of vigilance and cautious optimism, where fairness replaced fear. The skeleton in my yard, once a symbol of defiance, now stood as a monument to accountability. Its shadow no longer carried threat, but reassurance. I walked through my yard one afternoon, the grass vibrant, unbroken. Neighbors waved from their porches, some nodding, some smiling, silently acknowledging the shift. For the first time in years, the streets felt safe not because of rules on paper, but because the community itself had reclaimed control. The HOA's collapse had been decisive, but the real victory was in the culture it left behind, one of awareness, resilience, and quiet strength. Brenda's departure left a void that was impossible to ignore. Her absence was a relief, a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to wield authority without understanding its limits. The other former board members receded into private life, their influence evaporating as quickly as it had arrived. Ravenwood Shores thrived under the new management's careful oversight, and life resumed with a rhythm that felt earned. Even the neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke openly, sharing their experiences, supporting one another, and ensuring that no one would again suffer in silence. The community had survived, not because of legal maneuvers alone, but because people chose to stand together, informed and unafraid. As I looked across the neighborhood, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been delivered, accountability enforced, and the HOA's shadow finally lifted. Ravenwood Shores would continue, stronger for the lessons it had endured. And as the sun set behind the familiar homes, I understood that real power wasn't in intimidation or threats. It was in knowledge, patience, and the courage to see the rules enforced fairly. Brenda was gone. The HOA was gone. But the spirit of the neighborhood endured, wiser, safer, and unshakable. A year has passed, and the changes are undeniable. My rebuilt wing rises larger and brighter than ever, crafted meticulously, fully compliant, untouchable by any overreaching HOA claim. The lake reflects the sky without ripple from conflict. Streets that once felt tense are now calm, not because of fear, but because every neighbor finally understands the agreements and rules they once ignored. Knowledge has replaced uncertainty, and the quiet is earned. I never had to shout. I never had to intimidate. Every step I took relied on the law, the bylaws, and unwavering adherence to the contracts. Each action was measured, precise, and completely defensible. Authority, I learned, is not about wielding a clipboard or claiming a title. It comes from understanding your rights, owning your property, and having the patience to let the rules work in your favor. Brenda and the old board faded into the background, their attempts at control permanently undone. The neighborhood has healed, stronger for the lessons it learned, with boundaries now respected and abuses remembered only as cautionary tales. Sometimes the quietest victories are the most satisfying, permanent, undeniable, and fair. Justice doesn't have to scream to be effective, it only needs to be followed correctly. If you want more stories where rules, patience, and determination triumph over entitlement, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and which HOA battles you've witnessed firsthand.